a company can be dysfunctional or even harmful, but it doesn't rise to the level of being legally wrong. So you can see it in these sort of high stress, high reward industries where there are high stakes and a culture of aggressiveness and sometimes belittlement, almost like a hazing environment, right? And it becomes commonplace, and it's sort of like, this is the way we roll. Sometimes it gets reinforced in the sort of the culture of the company that, well, we're successful and you can either kind of become part of it or leave.
If you've ever sat at your desk wondering, is what's happening to me actually illegal? Or is my workplace just a mess? You are absolutely not alone. Today's episode is all about clarity. We're cutting through the confusion, the corporate noise, and the "my friend on TikTok said" advice to bring you the facts. I'm joined by employment law expert Nestor Barrero, who's going to help us understand what truly counts as discrimination, what rises to the level of harassment, what makes a workplace feel hostile, but the behavior isn't technically illegal and is unfortunately a bad boss or a toxic work culture. Most professionals don't know these distinctions, and it leads to frustration, burnout, and sometimes making the wrong move at the wrong time. Nestor is here to change that. If you're stepping into the new year thinking, I cannot do another year of this chaos, this episode will help you figure out exactly where you stand and what options you actually have. Let's get into it. Nestor, welcome to Work Unscripted.
Thank you for having me, Marlo.
So happy you're here today. So I'm going to throw out some pretty big words here, Nestor. You ready? Here they come. Discrimination, harassment, toxic workplace, bullying, hostile work environment. I personally hear professionals throw these around all the time, and I'm not sure that they realize, or if they realize, that what they're experiencing, as bad as it may be, whether it really rises to that level and that legal definition of these things. So let's just break it down right off the top so everybody understands what we're talking about. What is the difference between a bad boss who violates our values versus truly illegal behavior?
Right. The media often gets this wrong, as you can imagine. They're misused sometimes, especially by non-lawyers. Employees are surprised when they're told that what they're experiencing may be unpleasant, but it doesn't necessarily violate a law. And it can be a real fine line sometimes, but I'll try to put it in relatively simple terms. So discrimination, I think most people have kind of an intuitive sense of that. Unfair, unequal treatment, but it has to be based primarily on characteristics or categories that are protected under law, such as race, gender, disability, sexual orientation, among others.
Oh, so what does that look like? What does that look like in the workplace?
So it can be intentional. So, for example, you see this sometimes in age discrimination cases. We can't bring that person onto the team because they're just too old for the company culture. That's out there. That is, you don't fit. And I'm using something you have kind of no control about it. Legally, sometimes that's called immutable characteristics. You really can't change them: race, religion, age, sexual orientation. That can be intentional. It can also be unintentional. And that's a situation little harder sometimes to focus on, but it can be a situation where there's something that looks and sounds neutral, right? Everybody is expected to kind of fit into this category or have these qualifications, but in practice, it has what's called a disparate impact on a group of employees that may be covered by one of these categories. So the classic case was a case involving a power company called Duke Power out in North Carolina, I think, or Georgia, and they had a rule that said that everybody that worked in the plant, from top to bottom, including the janitors, including the people that cleaned up, had to have a high school diploma or a GED, high school diploma back in the day. So as far as Duke was concerned, that was fair. They weren't singling out anybody. They weren't saying, blacks need not apply, women need not apply. It was, you have to have a GED, and even if you're just mopping the floors, you have to have that high school diploma. And that ended up in a U.S. Supreme Court case, creating this idea that you can have a neutral practice, but it has a disparate impact, a way of
Oh,
screening out people. So imagine, who that screened out in the late 50s, 1960s in Georgia and North Carolina,
right.
mostly African American men. And the problem was, in order to sort of overcome that impact, the company had to show that there's some business necessity. There's something about the job that kind of overcomes this impact that it's having that's job related. And they had a very difficult time defending the idea that a high school diploma really was required to to work in a low skill job like janitorial.
So that's really different today, though, right? Because a lot of job descriptions require a college degree of some
Right.
sort.
Right. And it can still come up. But you have to, as an employer, be pretty careful that if you're imposing these requirements, that they really have something to do with the job.
Mm.
Now, I'll give you an example of something I dealt with a client early when I was an in-house lawyer. They had a big sales force, right?
Hmm.
And they implemented a personality test. It was a questionnaire, basically, back in the day. This was probably the late 1980s. And they had used this test with the existing sales force. And people that ranked fairly highly on some of the questions were probably some of the very good salespeople, men and women. But the way that the test had been put together had neglected to kind of consider that there might be a disparate impact situation. So, for example, they had questions like, how many books were in your home growing up? If and you can imagine, oh, my home was a library, or I didn't have a lot of books in my home, that gave you a higher or a lower rating. What was the best advice that your father gave you in your teenage years?
Ooh, what if you didn't have a father?
There you go.
Mm.
Another one was, what did you learn at sleepaway camp?
Oh, what if you couldn't afford sleepaway camp?
Exactly.
Mm.
What's the sport that means the most to you?
What if you couldn't afford to play a sport or you weren't
Well,
athletic?
maybe you had a disability,
Yeah, or you
or
had a disability. Right, right. So
etc.
those could be discriminatory questions, is what you're
Right.
saying.
And everybody that was a candidate to get into the sales training program had to complete that test, and then they were given a rating, right? Rating based on the scores. But the test itself was culturally and maybe even racially creating a disparate impact because it had been, and I don't want to get too in the weeds on sort of
Yeah, yeah.
psychological terms, but it had been validated on a group of employees that were successful sales employees. But what do you think that cohort of sales employees that did well on this test, for example, looked like?
They're
They were
all white male.
primarily male, primarily white, and primarily from privileged backgrounds.
Right.
So the company said, well, those are our best people. This test predicts who our best people are going to be. But they hadn't been considering, and the test maker, I think, hadn't been considering that they were screening out. And so then you had to go back to, well, wait a minute, what does having books in the house, going to sleepaway camp, being an athlete really have to do with selling whatever it was, financial services, right?
Right.
And my counsel to them was, you got to really adjust this and make this less looking like you're the only people who can succeed is people that score high on this test and who look a certain and come from a certain background.
And are
So that's
privileged. Right.
a long kind of winded example
Right.
of disparate impact. It's not intentional. Nobody wanted to screen out women or disabled people, but it ended up having that effect.
So you could see that like in the workplace today. Like this is what you're talking about hiring, right? But you could see that in the workplace of, say, a certain test or a certain thing you have to hit in order to get promoted,
Right.
right? Or
Yep.
a certain thing you need to hit in order to get a certain raise.
Right.
Right. Or you could see certain people get higher raises or higher bonuses than other people. That could be
Right.
discrimination if it's shown that it's happening regularly, and then and I know a lot of companies do what is that called? They do like a review and analysis every year to make sure that that's not happening. But not every
Right.
company does that.
They do a disparate impact
Thank you.
analysis.
Yeah,
Sophisticated companies, larger companies usually can do that. But I can't say that a startup does that. I
right.
can't say that
No.
a medium-sized company that doesn't have, lawyers on board or a lot of sophistication within their HR ranks do that. And so you end up in situations where you're hiring very naturally people that are just like the people that are already there, and that end up being the hiring managers or the people that are screening, and they're hiring people that are just like that.
And in a really tough market like we have right now, that could even be more prevalent, I would think, because
Yeah.
you're hiring people
Right.
hiring people that, oh, I knew this guy at the last company. I want to bring him over or her over or whatever the case may be.
Right.
So it could be much more prevalent,
Yeah.
in a tough market where
Right.
not so many people are moving, right?
Yeah.
And it's harder to find a job. So, all right,
Yeah.
let's jump to harassment
Okay.
because people are always saying my boss is harassing me. What
Right.
is harassment?
Think of it as kind of a subset of discrimination. It has to do with behavior, not just choices that you make, not screening devices. It has to do with behavior in the work environment. So it has to be an unwelcome type of conduct, but it still has to be linked back to a person's protected characteristic that creates, and this is the legal term, a hostile work environment that's intimidating, abusive, and where the offensive conduct could be a condition of employment or makes working in that environment almost intolerable. It's a fairly high standard, right?
Really high standard. So tell me like what rises to that standard. Do you have like an example or how this shows up where it truly is a hostile work environment?
Yeah, this happens a fair amount in environments that are dominated by a specific group, by men.
Oh,
Um, Sometimes I've even seen it. I was going back to some notes. I even saw a case that I worked on where it was almost a form of reverse discrimination. It was a person that worked at a large theme park who claimed that because he wasn't gay, he was straight, he was not being treated and basically harassed in a manner that was inappropriate. Jokes about being a breeder, jokes about you
oh,
don't get us. Sometimes in fun, sometimes, but kind of based on stereotypes. And it was sort of a constant thing because everybody that was around that did the costumes and that did the choreography and that did kind of the artsy part of this show that he worked on, happened to be gay in that environment. And so it was sort of a steady diet of that. Now, sex harassment gets the most attention, right? Me Too gets the most attention,
right.
where you have something being conditioned. Your progress in a job, your career is conditioned on having a relationship with the supervisor, or et cetera. But it can come up also in the harassment area. Again, remember that it requires a hostile, intimidating, or abusive work environment. That could be based on race. Sometimes you see that in very kind of egregious situations with somebody hung a noose at their desk, right? Um,
Hmm.
Jokes, repeated use of the N word, repeated jokes about what women are like, where it's kind of a constant diet. It doesn't have to be as dramatic as an assault. It doesn't have to be sort of Harvey Weinstein level,
Right.
but it has to be something that makes the environment intimidating and where it's difficult basically to do your job. That's
That's real.
harassment.
I think that would be really hard for somebody if I'm a professional, like I'm an employee and I feel like I'm being harassed or I'm in a hostile work environment. How
Yes.
do I know if I've hit that threshold? Because if I file a complaint and I'm not there, that
Yeah.
just does nothing for me, right?
Yeah. It's a common misconception. People use the word hostile work environment very freely, just like toxic work environment. And it's something that's very common among workers who are new to the job, and to believe that, just being uncomfortable at work, being reprimanded by a supervisor, getting a bad performance review, being asked to stop coming in late, or counseled on absenteeism, that is harassment. It's not. They're not being harassed. A term I hear from my clients, especially these days, is people say, "I don't feel safe." Right?
Mm.
I don't feel safe in that environment. But they're not talking really about physical or emotional safety, but believe that almost any conflict, criticism, instruction that they don't agree with is harassment, and that they're entitled to a quote conflict free. They wouldn't put it that way, but this is sort of what they're looking for. They're entitled to a conflict free environment so that they don't feel unsafe or uncomfortable. And that's not the legal standard.
So that, I think, is where I think people get confused, because I've been on the side of investigating a lot of cases, right, where somebody has complained of hostile work environment or toxic workplace. And really what it is that their values are being violated. How I want to be treated is
Yeah.
being violated, or I don't feel comfortable, or I don't feel safe because somebody's mean, or somebody's an asshole, or
Right.
somebody's not very nice, or
Right.
somebody's just talking to me in a way that just triggers me.
Yeah.
And those, I think you're saying, do not rise always to
Right.
the level of hostile work environment or harassment or toxic.
Right. Usually do not. Now, the law has developed that there was this concept before of the equal opportunity harasser. A man or a woman, she or he are just mean to everybody. They're caustic. They're not picking on people because they're black or they're gay or they're female. They're just, sort of out there, a little bit out of control, angry, humiliate people, etc. And there used to be this concept, and it's starting to fade away, but I still see it in some cases that, well, this is not harassment because it's not linked to any of these protected characteristics. There's a famous case involving the show Friends, where the brainstorming for the scripts that came out were very offensive, right?
I remember that.
It would ultimately be toned down from, X and R to PG by the time it made it to the show. But the brainstorming in the writer's room was totally credible, and it was very offensive. Offensive remarks about the actresses, about their physical features, etc. And in that case, the California Supreme Court gave a little bit of a creative necessity break in that situation. That is not going to obviously be the case in a doctor's office, in a sales environment,
Right.
in a company, in a warehouse, where it's not those sort of unique factors and scenarios that can come up in something like entertainment.
Totally. Yeah, no, I can see the difference for sure. The one thing we touched on toxic workplace, but we didn't really dive into it. And I think that's probably the words that are used the most is I work in a toxic place. My boss is toxic. Everybody's toxic.
Right.
What is toxic? Is that like a legal thing, toxic workplace?
So toxic is a fairly recent term in my experience. It usually means a workplace where there's negative behaviors, attitudes are prevalent that lead to an unhealthy environment for employees, can result in excessive stress, lack of trust, poor communication. But it's not a legal term. Hostile work environment, though, is a legal term, and that requires that again, we were talking about harassment, that there be unwelcome conduct based on a protected characteristic that's severe or pervasive. Those are the key words: severe or pervasive enough to create an abusive and intimidating work atmosphere that interferes with people's ability to do their job. So you can have a toxic workplace. Throwing out the term toxic workplace, and an environment can be, quote, toxic in the sense that, like I just read off, the negative behaviors, the unhealthy atmosphere, the increased stress, but it may not be a legally hostile work environment because, again, It's not related to, it's kind of like the equal opportunity harasser. It's not related to a particular characteristic.
So I think this is key, and I think people need to understand this. You can work in a toxic workplace or something that feels toxic to you, but if it does not rise to a hostile work environment or to harassment, then you can make a complaint, but there's a chance it's going to be deemed unfounded.
Right. And
Right?
yes, and this is not to say, because I counsel employers all the time, and we help create policies and handbooks that have now added the concept of bullying, of toxicity. This doesn't mean that it won't be a human resources issue, a productivity issue, a morale issue, something that the management should take action over, and they should. Someone's just a bully, but it's not based on any kind of protected characteristic. So you can still have a policy that, we will not tolerate bullying, we will not tolerate toxicity, etc. And the company may take action, but it may not be enough to actually violate a discrimination policy, to get a lawyer involved, for example, to file a claim with an agency like the California Civil Rights Department. They may look at it and say, yeah, I wouldn't want to work in this environment either, but it doesn't rise to the level of a hostile work environment. So that's the distinction.
So you mentioned bullying. What is
Mhm.
bullying? And that's not illegal in every state. That's the thing about bullying. Some states
No,
have a law and some states don't, right?
no, and most states do not have a prohibition that creates legal liability based on bullying. The way I've seen it defined is repeated unreasonable action of individuals, or it could be a group of people kind of all acting the same way, directed towards an employee or a group of employees. And these are the words that usually matter the most: intimidate, degrade, humiliate, or undermine, right? That kind of humiliating someone in front of a group, intimidating language, you'll do this or else, a misuse of power. Workplace bullying can involve all of that, but it may not always be linked to a protected category, class, or characteristic. And I'll give you an example. So you can imagine a situation where two persons within the same protected group, two women, two employees that are both of Latino or Hispanic origin, are in conflict, not because of their category, not because they're Latino or female, but because one person, sometimes a supervisor or a coworker, is dismissive, tries to humiliate the other, isolates them, uses profanity, loses their temper. Again, bullying behavior. But in that particular example, everybody's kind of in the same group. It's a group of women. It's a group of Latino employees. It may be bullying, but it may not be linked to anything that is illegal or that you could have a claim over. And remember, I'm a management lawyer. I'm looking at it from the standpoint of, is there liability for the company? There still could be liability for the company. People could go out on stress leave. People could file workers' compensation claims because of the atmosphere that they're working in. And most companies these days that are implementing bullying policies understand that and look at that as like closing a loophole, that the equal opportunity bad supervisor loophole. They can still take action, but it may not be enough to get a lawyer interested or a legal claim.
I like that we're talking to you, though, because you do represent companies. And I think that's
Yes.
the key. When you're a professional, you feel like everybody's trying to protect the company, right? Nobody's trying to protect me, the person who doesn't feel good in this situation. But what I don't think people realize is that you could be working in a completely dysfunctional, completely uncomfortable, completely unsafe environment to you, but the company or the boss or whoever it is not actually doing anything legally wrong.
Exactly.
Legally wrong. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying the behavior's good. The behavior's not good. What I'm saying is the company is only looking at it from a legal standpoint, most of the time, unless there's like a handbook that somebody's violated something in the handbook that maybe
Right.
isn't like a legal thing, correct?
Right. A company can be dysfunctional or even harmful, but it doesn't rise to the level of being legally wrong. And you've seen this, I think, and a lot of people you've seen it in these sort of high stress, high reward industries, talent agencies, high level finance, finance pros, sales, law, where there are high stakes and a culture of aggressiveness and sometimes belittlement, almost like a hazing environment, right? Um, and it becomes commonplace, and it's sort of like this is the way we roll. Uh, Again, I don't know that I'd want to work there, but it may not be illegal. And sometimes it gets reinforced in the sort of the culture of the company that, well, we're successful, and this is sort of what, um, you know, you can either kind of become part of it or leave.
It's so frustrating because I feel like that's the reason people don't file complaints, right? Because they don't trust the company already because of the situation that's going on. So,
Right.
what is your advice to somebody who feels marginalized, who feels like something bad is happening, but they're not really sure it's bad enough to
Yeah.
actually act on? Because if you file the complaint, I've seen the other side of the complaint, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but
Hmm.
they file the complaint or they're scared to file the complaint. What do they do?
Yeah. Well, I always encourage people to go to HR. I understand the reluctance, and it's totally a reality that it depends on the company culture from the top as to whether they're going to take it seriously, and what'll happen after that. I encourage, for example, people to speak to mentors. Right? Maybe there's a mentor. Maybe they're not even in their department, but they are well liked in the company. They're a peer, maybe, of the people that are involved in the toxic behavior. You may talk to somebody like that, and about coping strategies, and other kind of recommendations. Sometimes even without asking them to do anything, if there's someone you trust, they might take some kind of an informal approach on your behalf, right? Or maybe not even name you, but talk to whoever the boss is of the person that's making you uncomfortable and say, "Hey, I'm hearing these things, and we understand that there's a certain amount of tension that's sort of part of the business, but this seems to kind of be going too far." If you do talk to HR, I think it's always good to give examples. And one of the big things about talking to HR that think sometimes people lose sight of, they're only thinking about their personal situation. But if you bring something to HR and you give some good examples about what you're talking about, not just "I don't feel safe," but "Here's what happened on this date. I wrote this down in a log," or "Look at this email." If you can give those kinds of examples, especially about a specific person, HR may already have had other complaints, right? There may be already something in the works where that particular toxic supervisor has been talked to, has been warned, etc. You may not know about that, right? You may not know that there's already an investigation, that this person is already on a final warning. And you're coming and raising this may kind of push it for them to take some immediate remedial action, maybe perhaps termination or a suspension or
You
something.
never know what's happening behind the
You never
scenes.
know
That's what
what's
I tell
happening
people.
behind it. Exactly. And so that's one reason why raising it to HR can be valuable, because they have that history, and you may be adding to basically a course of behavior that they now feel they have an obligation to address.
But you're talking about, though, you don't just go to HR and say, "I don't feel good about this. I don't feel safe." You need to have the documentation. You need to have the dates, the
Right.
times, and
Right.
the actual behavior. What was said, what was done, what was the behavior, what was the reaction, who it was done to. And you need to have a log. Like, you can't
The
just
more,
walk in with feelings. It's not about
the more,
feelings, because the feelings means
yeah,
your values are being violated. It doesn't mean that you're at the level.
the more specific and the more you can give those examples, the better. If you can identify witnesses, right? I wasn't the only one that heard this. These three people were there too. Now, you can't necessarily predict if the witnesses heard it, are going to agree, are going to want to get involved. But but they might, and if they're approached separately, not necessarily by you, they may be, an ally. They may end up, being an ally if something that was particularly egregious happened in front of a group of people.
So if I do go to that mentor or I do go to somebody and I tell them what's going on, right? Somebody I trust, which I always say be careful, but if you do they have a legal obligation to report it? And what happens if they don't? Like, will they get in trouble?
The answer is it depends on whether they're a supervisor or a manager, right?
Okay.
If it's a peer, if it's someone who isn't really in a managerial or a supervisor or an executive role, then they don't really have an obligation. If they're a supervisor, though, the policies and the law basically sees them as speaking for the company, and when they get notice of a problem, they are required to bring it to some level, whether it's an ombuds, whether it's compliance, whether it's HR, higher level management, in order for the company to take action. And for companies, it unfortunately for the company, failure to take action if you're a manager, once you're on notice of something, can create liability for the company. So yes, the answer is yes. If they're a manager, even if they're not even in your department, even if they do have and should have an obligation and should be trained that way, so that it gets brought up. Coworkers, not really.
Nestor, have you ever seen legal bad behavior become illegal behavior later?
Yeah, not exactly, but I can give you an example about how behavior that was questionable but not illegal later came back to haunt an employer. And this was a client that I had. I advised a company that had a small group of technical employees, tech area. They were all mostly male, with three women in the department of around 10 people. The employees attended a trade show, some of them, and around 6 of them, 3 men and the 3 women, went to Las Vegas, had dinner with one of their vendors, and everything was fine. The dinner was ending, and the vendor then asked, "Does everybody want to go get after dinner drinks at the Hustler Casino?"
Ooh,
okay,
ouch.
that's a legal club, right? But the servers are scantily clad, not exactly,
Business friendly.
First choice for business, but nevertheless, they extended the invitation to the women as well as the men. The 3 women said, "We'll pass. We're going to go back and go to bed early." The 3 men went out. Everything was fine. Maybe a month or 2 later, 2 supervisor jobs opened up in that same department, right? They were posted. And after the interviews, 2 of the men that went to the Las Vegas trips and none of the women who were at the dinner were promoted. What do you think happened next?
Oh, it came out that they went to the Hustler Club, didn't it?
Right. Now, it wasn't directly related. And this is what I told the managers. I said, you could have picked the right people to be the supervisors, right? The experience, technical skills. Maybe you did everything right, but look at how your judgment and your decisions are now going to be clouded by this innocuous event in Las Vegas. It wasn't sexual harassment. They weren't required to go to the Hustler Casino. But immediately what came out and what the women told Human Resources when they didn't get the promotions was, of course, we're not going to get promoted. We're not part of the boys club. We didn't go along with the vendor in Las Vegas a month ago to the Hustler Casino. That's really what's going on here. It's the boys that enjoyed, the women at the Hustler Casino. They're the ones getting the promotion. They're not going to promote us.
Okay. So I bring a complaint, and I've seen this way too often. I bring a complaint. The complaint is unfounded, not because there isn't bad behavior, not because there isn't uncomfortable behavior, not because there isn't unsafe behavior, but the behavior does not rise to this legal definition of either harassment or discrimination or whatever the case may be. Then, and it's usually against the boss most of the time, then what happens is you go back and you work for the boss. Now the boss is upset that you brought a complaint against them. I've seen this, right? And
Yep.
they can't retaliate because there is a law against retaliation.
That's right.
But that relationship, even though it was bad to begin with in your brain, is never going to recover. I'm sorry. It's not going to recover without intervention. But I have yet to see many companies that intervene at that point, like provide team coaching or something. They might provide the boss some coaching, but that doesn't take away the negative feeling toward that employee who brought the complaint.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's a reality in the workplace. I'm not saying it's right, but it's a natural kind of reaction of someone who has been accused of something, and they may not agree that either they did it or that they did it in the way that was described, or that it was anything that they should really get reprimanded over. And then there's that suspicion, that lack of trust, that I'm not going to be able to kind of be myself in front of them ever again.
Yep.
And that manifests itself sometimes in retaliatory behavior, or what looks to be unintentional but retaliatory behavior, and they're not included on a phone call. They don't get invited to lunch. They don't get invited to the outing that they're having with the clients, because they're seen as trouble or difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that happen a lot. And I agree. Usually companies, when they hire a coach, someone like you, or they hire someone to come in and mediate or help with the work environment, they're mostly focused on the executive and not everyone else.
Not repairing that
Right.
relationship, which I did a lot in my last job. I did a lot of team coaching, rebuilding those relationships and rebuilding the communication and the understanding and that kind of thing. So question, what do I do if I'm the manager? This complaint has been brought against me. Say I'm not a jerk, right? Say I'm not. Say it was a complete misunderstanding, miscommunication. What should I be doing to try to rebuild that relationship with that employee who obviously feels very negatively toward me?
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, sometimes what companies do, and if they ask me, should we do this? I don't say, well, no, that's not a good idea. They may seek to have you report to someone else, right? Sort of,
Which
I don't
could
know.
be retaliatory depending upon the level and all that stuff, right?
On the other hand, I've seen that work out too.
Right.
They're not going to report directly to me. That may be seen as retaliatory. However, they're going to be working, with someone else who may be a kind of a better fit. And you don't affect their salary, you don't affect their promotion, you don't affect their bonus. Anything that's sort of tangible is not really affected. That may be, one way to do it. Again, depending on kind of the emotional intelligence, frankly, of the manager, will affect how they react to it. I mean, maybe it'll be a situation where it kind of cools down for a while, and they make efforts to be inclusive. I hesitate to recommend managers to, immediately go out and apologize, right? Create a record of an apology, or take the person out to lunch and, clear the air. I don't think I recommend that unless someone else is there, because then the back and forth might get a little bit unpleasant, and recollections are going to be different about whether that was a sincere apology or whether they were just window dressing and all that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah, and a lot of times it is window dressing trying to move forward, which unfortunately I've seen that as well. So when we're talking about companies and we're talking about employees, I also have seen that some managers, very poor managers, have tried to dress up, either discrimination or harassment with performance, claiming that the employee has a performance problem. And it's really the manager's bad behavior. Right? That they don't want to manage, quite frankly. They don't want to be the leader that they're expected to be. And and they're not communicating well, and they're not giving direction well, and they're not giving feedback well. And therefore, it's the employee's performance. Right. How does that play out in this scenario? Because usually the employee then does file the complaint. And here we go again, right?
Yeah.
So
a good manager, a manager who is being coached, who maybe has HR helping them, or a manager who does have these skills, will be dealing with poor performance or subpar performance all along the way, right? Before the complaint gets made. The tough cases, frankly, for lawyers on my side or for advisors to management are they were stellar until they complained to HR and now they can't do anything right. That starts looking like retaliation. But from my standpoint, the first question I'm going to ask is, if they're not meeting their sales goals, have they been talked about it before? Oh, yeah. Here's an email from January. Here's an email from May where, she wasn't reaching her goals. She was, 10% below all of the other salespeople. And we say, you're going to have to, do better on this. We're going to send you to a training. We're going to have you, kind of shadow this other salesperson to get you to improve. And it doesn't happen. And then the incident happens, the stupid remark, the misogynist remark, the racial remark. And then the next thing is, well, we're going to put you on a performance improvement plan. Obviously, the employee is going to see that as retaliation, but the company is in a much better position if there's a record.
Right. If you have that record.
Yeah. Absence of that, from the standpoint of the employee, if there is no record, you have a better, quote, case that way. Now, having a better case is fine, but you want a good case and then maybe not a job.
Well,
it is what often happens.
Yeah, let me flip this. So I have seen this as well, where an employee has a performance problem based on their boss, which a lot of times is subjective. But the point is, they're deemed a performance problem or a poor performer, and then they preemptively file a complaint. And they file that complaint, like you said, then the employer's in a better position. But then the employee goes on a leave of absence for stress, right, anxiety, whatever it is. They take a leave. You can't fire them while they're on a leave of absence, correct?
Usually not. If there's a reorganization, for example, and they would have been let go had they been in the workplace, and then that is usually not going to be a legal problem. But often what employers will do, depending on the length of the leave of absence, is they'll just put a pin in it and start it up again when they come back. So this idea that, well, I'll put time and distance between kind of what was going on in my performance, go on a leave of absence, and then maybe they'll sort of forget about it, doesn't usually work. And so most companies will sort of go back to square one and pick it up where they left off.
But do you find people going on a leave of absence to prevent being fired so they can look for a new job and give themselves that 6 weeks to try to find the next thing?
Exactly. That, and if it's a legitimate leave of absence, let's say there is some kind of a stress or a heart condition or high blood pressure, something that's developed from this. Now, in California especially, they can be protected by the disability laws, right? And so in that sense, you're sort of adding a potential claim to the arsenal of, here's why I didn't succeed. Now it wasn't so much that I complained about the boss, but now when I went out on a leave of absence, they saw me as, quote, damaged goods, right? And now it has more to do with, well, she couldn't hack it, and now she's having these stress leaves, and we're not going to be able to count on her anymore. And these stereotypes about disabilities or depression or anxiety start coming into the picture, which would be the allegation, and then it could strengthen a possible retaliation or discrimination claim.
So this sounds like the time in that scenario where the employee might want to consult a lawyer, but I've always seen that when you bring a lawyer into the picture, you automatically escalate it like tenfold.
Yeah, bringing a lawyer in, I think rarely, unless you immediately want to get into a exit strategy. Bringing a lawyer in rarely, I think, gets you to a place where you can continue successfully in the job. Most companies, once a lawyer is involved, naturally want to go to their lawyer. And then their lawyer gets involved, someone like me. And then, then the back and forth starts, or the exchange of letters. And it can be, it can heat up the situation, because I'll be compelled to point out all of the bad things that already existed that the employee is failing to tell their lawyer. One of the lines one of my canned lines in responses to demand letters is, "Your client has been less than forthcoming with you about the actual facts."
Oof.
And then, then I'll put the litany of, they probably didn't tell you this and they probably didn't tell you that. And then the employee obviously will see that, but their own lawyer will send it over and say, "What do you have to say about this?" And then that just escalates the lack of trust, the hostility, "I can't believe they brought that up." It gets very tense, and it may lead to an exit and some kind of a severance plan. One of the things I often see is, if the employee had kind of the personality and the skills to work something out on their own, they're usually better off because they still have to pay the lawyer. So if the lawyer gets them, 10% more than they could have on their own, well, now they're going to have to pay 30% of the settlement to the lawyer, and they're kind of worse off now than they were if they were able to handle it. Not everybody is capable of handling something on their own with HR or a manager.
So handling it on your own, when I think about that, and this is something that I have not given legal advice, but I've given friendly advice to people on because I don't practice law anymore. But I have told people that if you feel like you're being targeted, if you feel like your boss just doesn't want you there, if you feel like your boss wants you to quit, leave with some money. Ask for mutual exit, right? Where, hey, you clearly have a problem with me. You clearly are not happy with me. My performance is fine, but it's obvious that you don't want me here. Let's find a way for me to mutually separate. I get a little bit of cash so I can go find my next opportunity, and you get what you want, which is me leaving. Yeah. Is that the way you're talking about handling it? Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Like handling it on your own?
I think that is a sort of good way to do it. I encourage people to still document in a professional and non-threatening way. So when they're talking to HR about, "I see the writing on the wall," there is no recipe for success here. I still think, though, that they want to frame the complaints and have human resources and ultimately the decision makers thinking about, if we don't resolve this, these other things are going to become an issue about why it didn't succeed. It's not just me. These other people, are lined up to support me or to have anecdotes about this. It's affecting morale. It's affecting retention. So that they look at it from the standpoint of, do we really want to kind of air this now in a public way in a lawsuit if they go to a lawyer, or in an arbitration where witnesses have to be involved and management is going to be distracted with interviews and statements and all of this. There's a I call it a hassle value sometimes to the employer. They may say, "Well, no, there's nothing here," and they have to look at some of the non-financial impacts that a toxic workplace and being able to work something out with someone who's interested in working it out and leaving can be beneficial.
And it works a lot. I mean, I've seen it from an HR perspective. It does work because it gets rid of the swirl, it gets rid of the drama, it gets rid of the lack of productivity, it gets rid of it all. Right? Yeah. Everybody leaves, everybody feels decent, if you want to call it that. Right? Gosh, Nestor, this has been so enlightening. I hope this has helped our audience understand that just because you don't feel good, it doesn't mean that it rises to a legal problem. That being said, if you truly feel like you're being harassed, you're being discriminated against, consult an attorney, talk to a peer mentor, talk to somebody to try to understand whether it's worth filing that complaint. How can people find you? Now, do note, Nestor does represent companies, but he can refer you to other attorneys as well. But how can people find you if they have any questions?
Well, I'm in California. I'm in Century City in Los Angeles. My law firm is called Constangy, Constangy. Brooks, Smith and Profit, but Constangy is the main name. And I'm available at nbarrero@constangy.com. You can find the name Constangi on a Google site, and you can find our webpage that explains the firm. You may have listeners, though, that are managers themselves
Yep.
or are executives themselves, and may occasionally need some kind of advice, whether it's a handbook, whether it's planning for layoffs, whether it's somebody advising them on just these situations from the management side. And that could be an opportunity.
Nestor, thank you so much for coming
Thank you,
on the
Marlo.
show. Hopefully this educated people. And if anybody wants to reach out to Nestor, feel free. He just gave you his email. And thank you again.
Okay. Thank you, Marlo. Glad to do it. I hope we can talk again.
All right, friends, if you took one thing from this today, let it be this. Feeling miserable at work does not automatically mean you're in a hostile or a toxic work environment, but it does mean something needs to change. Whether that's setting boundaries, documenting issues, having a tough conversation, or exploring an exit, knowledge is power. Thanks for listening, and if this episode helped, share with someone who's trying to figure it out, whether their job is bad or they're experiencing something illegal. And as always, leave a quick rating or review to support the show. See you next time. Work Unscripted is produced and edited in partnership with the team at Palm Tree Podco and 21 Digby. The content for this week's episode was created by me, Marlo Lyons.